First thing I want to do before we open up to the book of Genesis, which is where we're going to be for the next few minutes, is just that I want to take a second and just say a very special thank you to you for coming out to this conference, especially because I realize what Friday nights are like at the end of a tough work week. My wife and I actually have our date night going back 15 years to when we got married. We have our date night on Friday nights. But the thing about Friday night date night is that about, say 14 years ago, my wife and I just decided that we were flat too tired to have date night on Friday night. And so we just canceled it completely. And now we just take out Thai food and sit in front of the TV and watch like Chopped or Diners, Drive-Ins, and Dives and imagine that we're at nice restaurants while we're eating our Thai food. So I know how Friday nights are, and I know that most of you, if not all of you, have got to just be exhausted after a hard week. I mean, for some of you, you're coming off a week of really hard and grueling work. Maybe you even put in 60 or 80 hours this week in your job, and you're just exhausted. I mean, maybe for some of you, those 60 or 80 hours a week were good. You got a lot done, you were productive, but you're just tired, and you need a weekend. For others of you, the last 40, 60, 80 hours maybe were some of the most frustrating in your life. For some of you, maybe you were sending out resumes and looking for a job. I don't know what it was. I just know that at the end of a week, on a Friday night, maybe the last thing you want to do is come and sit and listen to somebody else talk. So I take it as an honor to us here at the Gospel at Work that you would take this Friday night when you could be sitting at home watching Diners, Drive-Ins, and Dives. You've come here to listen to me and David and Justin and Sebastian and the rest of us. So thank you for that. What I want to try to do this evening at the end of the week is just spend a little time encouraging you. Whether you've come off a week that's already pretty encouraging in terms of your job, or whether it was a discouraging week and incredibly frustrating, or whether this is a season in your life when you don't even have a job. What I want to do is take a little time from God's Word to try to encourage you in a couple of different ways. And I want to do it through, I think, one of the most well-known and well-loved stories in the entire Bible, and that is the life of Joseph. I think the reason that the story of Joseph at the end of Genesis, it takes up the last 14 chapters of the book of Genesis. So it's a huge story in that book and really in the whole story of the Bible. I think one of the reasons that it is so precious to us and so well known is that it's literally kind of the little orphan Annie story of the Bible. It's this local boy. He starts out as a shepherd, but he makes it big. He goes from rags to riches and winds up going from a guy who's out in the fields looking over some sheep and being a shepherd to being kind of the second in command of the greatest superpower on the face of the planet. Or at least that's kind of how the thing is understood, right? Great rags to riches story. But actually, I think there's something else going on in the story that's far more than just rags to riches. There's another character in the story who is active, not just behind the scenes, but right in the front of the scenes. And the story of the life of Joseph isn't really so much the story of the life of Joseph as it is the story of God in the life of Joseph. So when you read those 14 chapters of Genesis, what you're supposed to do is not just feel good for Joseph, this mistreated boy who winds up becoming a king and making it big. You're supposed to rejoice and marvel at this God who has done such amazing things in the life of Joseph and who is sovereign over every little detail in his life. So we're not going to take the time, we could, but we're not going to take the time to read all 14 chapters of the story. I wish we could. It would take, 30 minutes to do that, but we are. I'm just going to run you through the story and tell you how things unfold from Genesis chapter 37 to Genesis chapter 50. Here's the story of Joseph. The whole thing opens in Genesis chapter 37 with this kid, 17 years old or so, having a series of dreams in which his mother and his father and his older brothers all wind up bowing down to him. So one of the dreams has to do with the sun and the stars and the moon and all these things in the heavens bowing down to him as if he's a great king. There's another dream that he has in which these sheaves of grain are all gathered around his own sheaf of grain, and then they all bow down to him. And the message of those dreams is, all you brothers who are older than me, and even mother and father at the same time, are going to wind up on your knees in front of me, and I'm going to rule over you. That's the dream that little younger brother Joseph tells to his older brothers. Now, I don't know how many of you are younger siblings. Raise your hand if you're a younger sibling to somebody else. You guys tell me exactly how wise it would be to tell your older sibling about a dream that you have that they're going to bow down to you someday. Not super. No. Well, Joseph tells his brothers the dreams. Hey, I had these 2 dreams where you guys are going to wind up bowing down to me, and I'm going to be your king. Isn't that cool? The brothers don't like it at all, so they decide to kill him. Well, one of the brothers, the oldest, Reuben, he's clearly the most mature. He steps in and says, look. Let's not kill the little dude. Let's just throw him in a pit and sell him into slavery. That'll be much better. That'll keep us out of trouble with our father. So that's what they do. A caravan comes by. It's headed south. It's going toward Egypt. And so they sell their little brother Joseph into slavery. The caravan heads south. It arrives in Egypt. Joseph himself is bought by a man named Potiphar, who just happens to be the captain of Pharaoh's guard. Well, in time, Joseph rises to become the chief slave in Potiphar's house. He's like in charge of the whole thing. He begins as a sort of low-down slave working in the kitchens or the latrines or whatever it is, but eventually he rises up, gets promoted over and over until he's in charge of Potiphar's entire house. Well, he works there until Potiphar's wife realizes that this kid, who's probably 17, 19 years old, something like that, is pretty handsome, and she tries to get Joseph to sleep with her, Potiphar's wife. Joseph refuses to do it because he still understands that he's accountable to and responsible to God, so he flees the house and leaves. Well, Potiphar's wife tells Potiphar that what happened is that Joseph tried to rape her. She lies about it, and so Potiphar has Joseph thrown in prison. Now, there are 2 other officials in the prison, 2 other sort of high-ranking officers in Pharaoh's court who are in the prison. There is Pharaoh's chief baker, and then there is Pharaoh's chief cupbearer, who were, for reasons we don't know from the Bible, thrown into prison by Pharaoh right about the same time Joseph was. Well, one night, both of these guys, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, both have a dream, and they can't, either one of them, figure out what their dream means. One of them has to do with the cupbearer has this group of grapes and some birds come and eat it, and the other one has, the baker has a basket of bread on his head and the birds come and eat the bread. There are all kinds of details to it. But anyway, they're talking about these dreams, and Joseph says, you know what, there is a God in heaven who allows me to interpret dreams. So let me explain to you what your dreams mean. He says, for both of you, your dreams kind of sort of mean the same thing. Both your heads are going to be lifted up. Now for you, Mr. Cupbearer, what that means is that when your head is lifted up, what that means is that Pharaoh's kind of going to lift your chin up like this and restore you to your job. He's going to put you back into your position as the chief cupbearer. Now, Chief Baker, your head is going to be lifted up too, but maybe up is not exactly the right word. Maybe we should go more with your head is going to be lifted off, because Pharaoh is going to hang you and he's going to behead you. So same sort of idea, kind of, but not really, right? Well, 3 days later, it's Pharaoh's birthday, and it all happens just like Joseph says. The cupbearer is restored to his position. His head is lifted up. He's put back as the chief cupbearer, and he's giving the cup to Pharaoh. Everything's perfect with the cupbearer. The baker gets hanged and beheaded just like Joseph said. One of the last things that Joseph told the cupbearer, though, he said, your head is going to be lifted up. You're going to be restored to your position. But remember me while I am in prison and mention me to Pharaoh when you get there. When you get to the throne room, you're restored to your position. Just mention me to Pharaoh. Remember me. Don't forget me. Well, the cupbearer forgets him. And so Joseph winds up languishing in this prison for more than 2 years. He eventually rises from being one of the lowest prisoners in the place to one of the highest prisoners. So he goes from cleaning the latrines in the toilet to being sort of over all the prisoners underneath Potiphar himself. 2 years later, Pharaoh himself has a couple of dreams that he doesn't know how to interpret. And when Pharaoh has those dreams, he tells all of his officials about them. Here are the dreams that I had. Is anybody able to interpret them? I saw these cows coming out of the river, and 6 of them were very fat, and then 6 of them were lean, and then the lean ones ate the fat ones. And he had another dream, and he explained it to them all, and they all said, we have no idea. We don't know what the dreams mean. We can't tell you what it means. And the cupbearer, ding, he remembers. Oh, Pharaoh, there's a fella down in the prison. I meant to tell you about this 2 years ago, but I forgot in the excitement of being restored to my position. There's a fella down in the prison named Joseph who was able to interpret my dream and the former baker's dream, and it worked out just like he said. Why don't we go pull him out of the prison? See what he says about this. So that's what they do. Pharaoh sends to the prison. They bring Joseph up. Pharaoh tells him the dream, and Joseph interprets the dream. What it means is that there are going to be 7 years of amazing abundance in Egypt. You're going to have these incredible crops that are going to grow, and you're going to have more than enough food for the people of Egypt. And then you're going to have 7 years of just searing awful, starving famine. So Joseph says, here's what the dreams mean. He tells him, and he says, here's what you ought to do. What you need to do is that during the 7 years of abundance, you need to store up food so that the nation can survive during the 7 years of famine. Well, Pharaoh thinks this is a great idea, and so he appoints him to an office that would have been known as something like the Grand Vizier of all Egypt. He says, I'm going to make you second in command of the entire kingdom, and the only way, in fact, that I, myself, the Pharaoh, will be greater than you is with respect to the throne. So you have all the power that I do. Here's my royal ring. Here's my chariot. Here's the robe and the circlet on your head. Here's the whole thing, the trappings of royalty. The only way that I, the Pharaoh, am greater than you is with respect to the throne. So Joseph takes the office and he begins to do exactly what he told Pharaoh he should do. He saves up food during the years of abundance, and then he begins to dole out the food to the people of Egypt during the years of famine. Well, what happens is that the famine lands on all the land. It's not just Egypt that the famine hit. It's like all surrounding lands, including Canaan, which was Joseph's own hometown or homeland and where his family was living. They too were hit with the famine. So what happens is that everybody in the surrounding area hears that the only place in the known world essentially that's got food is Egypt, because they saved it up during the years of abundance. So back in Canaan, Joseph's brothers, who had sold him into slavery in the first place, get wind that there's food in Egypt, and so they come down, directed by their father to come down. And they find themselves in the presence of Joseph, who they don't know any longer. He's dressed up in these Egyptian clothes, and he's got the Egyptian face, all the rest of it. They don't recognize him. They buy some food. There's all this back and forth that goes on. But eventually, at the end of the story, what winds up happening is that because Joseph had risen to the office of Grand Vizier, he was able to save his family when they moved into Egypt to escape the famine. Well, eventually, Joseph goes back to Canaan. He lives another 60 years. He dies. He's embalmed, and he's put into a coffin in Egypt. And 400 years later, the book of Exodus begins with all the people of Israel, the descendants of Jacob, his father, in slavery now in Egypt. It's an incredible story. Just an amazing story of God's providence and God's sovereignty in the life of this one man that ended up impacting a nation. What does that mean for us? When you look at that whole story, the 14 chapters, what does it have to do? What does it have to do with us? What does it have to do particularly with our jobs and our work, which is what we're here to talk about? Well, at my own church in Louisville, at 3rd Avenue, I like to give my congregation a couple of sentences at the beginning of every sermon that sort of encapsulate the main idea of what we're going to be talking about for the morning. So let me give you tonight the main idea, I think, of what I want to communicate with you tonight from the book of Joseph, or from the story of Joseph. Here's the main idea. Whatever the circumstances of your job, this is the thing I want you to hear tonight. Whatever the circumstances of your job, whether you like them or not, remember that God has a purpose for it all. Even if it's not the purpose you expected or even wanted. Whatever the circumstances of your job, whether you like the job or not, remember that God's got a purpose for it all, even if that's not the purpose you expected or even wanted. Now, friends, that's got relevance to every single detail of your life, right? That's got relevance to you with your family, with your friends, with your relationships, if you struggle with some sort of sickness, if you're struggling with some sort of other circumstance in your life, that sovereignty of God, the purpose of God, has relevance to all of it. But it's got relevance to our jobs too. And I think you see that very clearly in the life of Joseph. You ever notice in the story of Joseph how many different jobs Joseph had throughout his life? I mean, think about it. Over the course of 14 chapters, Joseph has over a half a dozen different jobs throughout the course of his life. He starts out as a shepherd, then he becomes a household slave, then he becomes a head household slave, then he becomes a prisoner, then he becomes a head prisoner, then he becomes an advisor to the king of Egypt, and then he becomes the grand vizier, second in command of all Egypt. I mean, it's like more than 6 or 7 or 8 different jobs that Joseph's got in his life. It's just an astonishing life that he has. And I think as you read through that story and think about it, there are several lessons to be taken from that, even some surprising ones that we can learn from the life of Joseph. So what I want to do over the next few minutes having kind of laid out that story, is give you 6 different points of application, 5 or 6 different points of application. I'm not going to give them to you as we go, but I'm not going to give them to you now. I'm going to give them to you as we go. There are actually 5 of them. 5 points of application that I want you to see from the life of Joseph. First of all, here's the first one. Number 1, first, whatever circumstances you find yourself in other words, whatever are the mechanics of your job, whatever are even the mechanics perhaps for some of you of your unemployment in this season of your life, whatever circumstances you find yourself in, remember that you are working ultimately for your God. Whatever your circumstances, remember that you are working ultimately and finally for your God. I think if there's any sort of theme, second to just watching God's hand in the story of Joseph, if there's any theme that you can see running throughout the story of Joseph, it's that in every single one of those jobs, the Bible makes it clear that Joseph understood that he was working ultimately for the Lord. Now you think about the jobs, and he had lots of different bosses in those jobs. Right? When he was a shepherd, his boss was sort of his father, his family. When he got sold into slavery in Egypt, his boss became Potiphar. And then when he went to the prison, his boss became the warden of the prison. And eventually his boss was the king of Egypt. But in every single one of those jobs, he never lost sight of the fact, no matter who his immediate boss was, who his immediate supervisor was, he understood that he ultimately was going to give account to God. And not the gods of Egypt, his own God, Yahweh, the Lord, the God of Israel. That's who he was going to give account to. Friends, that's true of you too. I mean, when you go to your job, whatever it is, you probably have people to whom you're accountable, right? I assume so. I mean, even those of you who are sort of your own bosses, you have clients or customers or somebody that you're accountable to, right? I mean, there's somebody that pays money to you to do what you do. If you're the president and CEO of the company, I would assume that you've got a board or some stockholders or something to whom you are accountable. And sometimes it's easy to lose sight of the fact that there is, in fact, a higher level of authority above whoever it is that you immediately report to. God himself sits enthroned over the whole thing. In your job, whatever you are doing, no matter the mechanics of it, no matter even whether you're particularly thrilled with the mechanics of the job, you do what you do for your God. Let me give you a kind of sort of personal diagnostic tool that might be helpful with you. I think that when it comes to our assignments, when it comes to our jobs in life, most people, most Christians fall into one of 2 gigantic problems. And these 2 gigantic problems, I think, wind up causing about 95% of the trouble that we have in our jobs and in our assignments. Here they are, the 2 huge problems. Either our hearts tend to make an idol of our jobs, an IDOL, or our hearts manage to become idle in our jobs, IDLE. So 2 different diagnostic tools, and you can probably I bet most of you can do a diagnosis on yourself in about 5 seconds. Yep, I either tend to make an idol of my job, or I tend to become idle in my job. Let me define those for you just a little bit. If you're the kind of person that makes an idol of your job, you're falling into a theme that shows up throughout the Bible from Genesis all the way to Revelation. The Bible talks a lot about idolatry, and what it means is to find your sense of meaning and satisfaction and to find your object of worship in something that is not worthy of that worship. That's what it means to idolize something, to make an idol of it. So in the Old Testament, for instance, it was a very concrete sort of thing. You might have these, a statue. I mean, you all know it. It's like Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, right? It's a little golden statue, and Indiana swipes it. That was kind of the Old Testament idea of an idol. They actually had statues, and they would bow down to those statues and venerate them in various ways. In our own day, it's not quite that straightforward, right? I mean, very, very few of us would have little wooden or stone or metal statues that we bow down to, but we tend to bow down to all kinds of things in our lives. To worship them, to give them our meaning, to give them our energy, to give them our effort, to give them our worship, to let them define who we are as people. And for a lot of us in this room, I would imagine our jobs take pride of place as the number 1 idol in our lives. If things are going well in the job, we feel really good about ourselves as people. But if the stock price dips, or if the boss isn't happy with us, or if somebody says that our work isn't up to snuff for a particular week or a particular month, or if we don't hit the sales goals, whatever it is, all of a sudden, it's not just that we haven't performed exactly like we want to, but we are lesser people than we intended to be. We just kind of collapse on the inside. What about idleness? If we can make an idol of our jobs, what about idleness? How do our hearts become idle in it? I mean, the Bible's got a lot to say about idleness. If you get right down to it, you read through the Proverbs, you can get into the New Testament. Paul at one point in one of his letters says, look, if you're going to be idle with your hands, you don't eat, right? You need to be busy. You need to be working with your hands. You need to live a quiet life and work with your hands. And if you don't do that, you're not going to eat. So at the very basic level, Paul just says, don't be idle. Don't be lazy. Don't sit still. Don't do nothing. Be active. Be creative. Do something with your life. That's what Paul wants us to do in that letter. But I think idleness can be much more insidious than just idleness of the hands, right? I mean, most of us are not idle with our hands. Most of us, in fact, are incredibly busy most of the hours of our day. I remember several years ago, like when I was a kid, and somebody would just ask you the sort of, you know the question that they ask when they're sort of making small talk, but they don't really want to hear anything from you in answer to the question. They'll say, how are you doing? And what you're supposed to do to that question is give like a one-word answer and then move on and talk to the next person, right? When somebody says, how are you, they're not actually asking how you are. They just want you to answer with one word. Well, the one word that we used to answer that question was fine. I'm fine. And then you can move on with the next person. I don't think it's that anymore. At least not in my experience. When somebody asks the question these days, how are you? The one-word answer that we give to the question is, I'm busy. Busy. Things are good, but busy. Busy, but good. And that's what we say. Most of us aren't idle with our hands. But far more insidious than idleness of the hands, when it comes to your job, is idleness of the heart. In other words, as busy as you might be with your hands, moving this and doing this and typing on the computer and making the phone call on 2 different phones at the same time, working the emails, all the rest, as busy as you might be, it's incredibly easy for your heart's eyes to simply lose sight of why all this is happening in the first place. And so you start to think of your job as just a necessary evil to make money so that you can do something fun. You start to think of Monday through Friday as just the necessary slog to get to Saturday and Sunday so you can get to the really important stuff, maybe of family and church. You forget that each one of us, on average, is going to spend something like 80,000 hours of our lives working in a job. I promise you, if God has put that many hours of something in your life, He means for that to be an important part of your discipleship to Jesus. That's not just there as an accident. God didn't just put 80,000 hours of your life into work simply to get you to the important stuff of 20 hours or 30 hours a week. You can go idle in the heart and forget about that. Just fail to see God's purposes in all of this at all and just kind of slog through it. So spend some time thinking about your own heart. Which is it? Is it idolatry or is it idleness that you tend to fall into? When it comes to your job, do you make an idol of it, or does your heart become idle in it and you lose sight of why it's there in the first place? Let me give you the key to cutting the root of both idolatry and idleness in your job. The key to cutting both idolatry and idleness in your job is to remember that what you're doing, whether you like it or not, whether it's fulfilling or not, whether it matches your passions or not, whether it's what you intended for yourself or not, whatever you are doing it ultimately for your God. A couple of places in the New Testament that tell us this. Ephesians chapter 6, verses 5 to 7. Listen to what Paul says here. Ephesians 6, 5 through 7. He says there that you're to do your work with a sincere heart, not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but as servants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will, and rendering that service as to the Lord and not to man. Here's Colossians 3:23. It says essentially the same thing. Whatever you do, Paul says, work heartily, as for the Lord and not for men. As for the Lord and not for men. As for the Lord and not for men. Do you see what he's saying there? Whatever you're doing, whatever the mechanics of it, and whatever your feelings about it, you're doing it for your God, not for merely other people. Now, how does that cut the root of idolatry and idleness? Well, think about it. I mean, if your tendency is to think of your job as an idol, as the thing that brings meaning and satisfaction and purpose to your life, such that if that thing is going well, everything in your life is going well, but if it topples, then your life topples along with it. If that's your tendency, think about how the root of that sin could be cut if you recognize that this thing is a means to the end of glorifying King Jesus. See, all of a sudden then, your meaning and purpose and satisfaction and reward and identity and everything else about you is not tied up in this thing that could fall over in any given moment, but your meaning, identity, and purpose is in Christ, who is the same yesterday and today and forever and never changes. You remember that you work for the King, and the root of idolatry in your job gets cut off. What about idleness? What about idleness? If you're the kind of person that just completely loses sight of what you're doing and thinks of your job as just a means to an end, just a slog to get through to the weekend, just a way to make money so that you can do the fun and important stuff. What happens in your heart if you remind yourself that no, what I do, whether I like it or not, no matter what I feel about it, what I'm doing, I'm not ultimately doing it for itself or for the client or for the boss or for the shareholders. Ultimately and above all, I'm doing it for King Jesus. How can your heart go idle if you remember that? How can you turn in a half-baked job in your workplace if you remember that you're doing it for your King? See, it's incredible what Paul says there. It sounds simple. It's only just a few words. As to the Lord and not from men. As to the Lord and not from men. But it changes everything. It's just like a little nuclear bomb that goes off at the root of our hearts when it comes to our work. And changes everything. That's the first thing I want you to see from the story of Joseph. Everything that he did, no matter the circumstances, whether he was in prison or a slave in the house of Potiphar or the grand vizier of all Egypt, everything he did ultimately for his God. Here's the second thing. Number two, remember that God is sovereign over every detail of your life, including the job that you are in right now. God is sovereign over every single detail of your life, including your job. Including, for some of you, I assume, the fact that you don't have a job right now. God is sovereign over all of that. Let's think about the story of Joseph again for just a second. If there's anything that stands as kind of the main theme of the story, like the main thing you're supposed to be watching as this whole 14 chapters plays out, it's the fact that every single step of it, every tiny, seemingly insignificant event, every little detail of it is happening at God's direction because God wants it to happen that way. In other words, from beginning to end, from the time that Joseph is a shepherd to the time that he finds himself dying in Egypt, embalmed in a coffin, in a pyramid probably in Egypt, God himself is meticulously superintending every one of those events to bring about a specific outcome that he wants. Think about chapter 37, which is the very beginning of the story. Why does God give Joseph the dreams at the beginning of chapter 37? I mean, if you're talking about a story about the little orphan Annie, for instance, you don't need the dreams, right, to make the story interesting. In fact, if you think about it, if all you think about the story of Joseph is that it's kind of the little orphan Annie of the Bible, and that it's a rags to riches story, and we're supposed to applaud Joseph as he's rising through the ranks, and you're supposed to be amazed at how good things wind up for him, putting the dreams at the beginning of the movie, so to speak, sort of sucks all the drama out of it, doesn't it? I mean, my wife and I went to a movie not too long. It wasn't on a Friday. We don't do that. We went to a movie. This was some time ago because it was one of the Iron Man movies. I don't remember which one it was. So we got our tickets checked in. We were like a couple of minutes late to the movie, and so we knew that we were going to be missing some of the previews. This is just part of the deal. But you've got like 20 minutes of previews, so we didn't think it was going to be a big deal. So we walked down the hall, made a right-hand turn into the theater, sat down, and realized that Iron Man was already on. And so we thought, oh my goodness, this must be, the previews must have gone really fast, or they didn't have previews, or what is this great thing that we're doing now? The movie was on. We thought we had missed like a couple of minutes. Well, we sat there for about 10 minutes watching this movie, trying to figure out what was going on, and we realized that rather than sort of building up puzzles and things that you were going to have to figure out as the movie went on, the movie was actually solving every single problem and question that was going to come up. We had walked into the wrong theater and got the end of the movie before the beginning, which ruined the whole thing, right? So we sort of realized what was going on, and we like stuck our fingers in our ears and la 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 la, and went out of the movie theater, found our own, sat down, and watched the movie from the beginning. But it totally ruined the movie, right? Because we knew everything, how everything was going to work out. We knew every question, every puzzle, just right there in the last 10 minutes. We saw it. It sucks the drama out when you take the end of the film and put it at the beginning. So why does the Bible do that with the story of Joseph? I mean, why not just let the drama sort of rise up? There's a shepherd boy, and he winds up being, you've watched this story up and down, up and down, up and down. Oh, look, he's the grand vizier of Egypt. But it blows it by saying, he's going to wind up king, guys. That's the end of the story. I mean, why does the Bible do that? Well, maybe it's because the story of Joseph isn't just meant to be a rags to riches story. Maybe the story of Joseph is actually meant to teach us the very fact that God is the one superintending all of this. Maybe the reason that the drama is sucked out of it in chapter 37 is because God is calling his shot. And at the end of the film, he doesn't want you to be so much amazed that Joseph wound up being Grand Vizier of Egypt. He wants you to be amazed that he orchestrated every little detail. I mean, it's like Babe Ruth going, it's going that way. That's what God's doing in chapter 37. It's God calling his shot. It's also what Joseph meant with that great summary statement in chapter 50, verse 20. You ever seen what he said there? He's explaining to his brothers. His brothers are broken by the end of this story, right? They've recognized how badly they've messed up, and Joseph has forgiven them, and they're having dinner together and all the rest of it. And they come to him and said, Joseph, we're so sorry for what we did to you, selling you into slavery. How could we have done this? We repent in dust and ashes and all the rest. And Joseph gives this amazing statement in chapter 50, verse 20. He says to them, look, you guys meant it for evil, but God meant it all for good. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. Now you gotta pay really close attention to the words there, because it says God meant it. It doesn't say you guys meant it for evil, but God turned it to good. That's not what it says. It doesn't say, you guys gave me lemons, but God turned it into lemonade. That's not what it says. It says, you meant it for evil. You really did something evil. You meant for that to happen, and you meant for it to turn out bad for me. You didn't want to kill me. You wanted the Egyptians to kill me, or at least you wanted me out of your life. You meant it for evil. God meant it for good. Every little detail of it, he meant it for good. You see what that means? God meant 400 years later to rescue his people from Egypt in the second greatest redemption that's ever happened in the history of the world. The cross was the first. And therefore he meant for his people to be in slavery in Egypt, and therefore he meant for that family to come to Egypt in the first place, and therefore he meant for Joseph to be there as the grand vizier to welcome them and pave the way for them, and therefore he meant for Joseph to hear the dreams of Pharaoh, and therefore he meant for Joseph to be in prison with the cupbearer and the baker, and therefore he meant for all of these things to happen and for Joseph ultimately to be sold into slavery by his brothers who meant the whole thing for evil. God was in meticulous and sovereign control of the whole thing. And you can see it in every detail of the story. I mean, just over and over again, you can see it in every detail. I mean, the fact that the brothers decided not to kill him, but rather to sell him into slavery, that was God. The fact that the first caravan that passed by was headed to the south toward Egypt rather than to the north toward Assyria, that was God. The fact that Joseph was sold to Potiphar and not to somebody else in Egypt, that was God. The fact that Potiphar was this high-ranking official in Pharaoh's court, who was over a prison in which high-ranking officials would go, that was God. The fact that Potiphar's wife lied in order to get Joseph thrown into that prison, that was God. The dreams that were had by the cupbearer and the baker, that was God. It was all God from the very beginning. He was sovereign over every detail of Joseph's life. Friend, that's true in your life too. God is sovereign over every single detail in your life, including your job. I think it was Abraham Kuyper who said that there is not one square inch of this universe over which the Lord Jesus Christ does not cry, mine. Very true. But friend, there is also not one split second of history over which the Lord Jesus Christ does not cry, mine. You see what that means? Do you see what that means? Joseph was in the prison because God meant him to be in the prison. Joseph was in Potiphar's house because God meant him to be in Potiphar's house. Joseph was in the palace of Pharaoh because God meant him to be in the palace of Pharaoh, and you are where you are right now because God means you to be there right now. He means you to be there. Whatever the mechanics of your job, whether you like it or not, whether it's where you intended to be or not at this point in your life, whatever your feelings about that job, you are there for this season of your life at least because it is God who has put you there, and he's done it for some purpose. I mean, think about it like this. I mean, this is true. The fact of this is true, whether you like the job or not, right? And what that means is that if God has put you in that job, and if you're doing your work ultimately for your God, then you ought to do it with energy and faithfulness. That's ultimately what it means. Whether you like it or not, if God has put you there, and if God is sovereign over every detail, then you ought to do your job with energy and faithfulness simply because it is your King who's deployed you there. You ever think about that? I mean, think about it. Let's just let's talk about the reality of what the gospel of Jesus Christ does for us as Christians. I mean, it's like this world rebels against the high King of heaven. That's the story of Genesis and really the story of all of humanity. We as humanity rebel against the high King of heaven, but the high King of heaven, instead of wiping out the rebels, which he had every right to do, instead of just sending us all to hell and pouring out his wrath on us and putting an end to the whole thing, he decides he's going to save some of us. And so Jesus, the second person of the Trinity, the Son of God, becomes human and reinvades the world and offers mercy to those of us rebels who would bow our knee to him, repent of our sins, and put our faith in him for salvation. Right? He extends the hand of mercy and says, take my hand, I am the king, I've reinvaded the world, and I'll have mercy on you if you just acknowledge me as king, trust me to save you. Live the life you should have lived from the beginning, I'll stand in your place. Die the death that you deserve for your sin, I'll do that for you too. Just take my hand, bow to me, repent of your sins, I'll save you, I'll stand in your place. Now imagine that you're one of those people, right? If you're a Christian, that's exactly what's happened to you. You've been offered mercy by the king. And let's say that not only does the king save you and offer you forgiveness and then sort of, slap you on the rear end and send you along your way, but he summons you, right? He summons you before his throne and he says, my child, I have done everything that's necessary to save you. And now, not only am I going to offer you forgiveness and salvation, but I'm also going to offer you the opportunity to be a part of my work in the world. So I'm going to give you a deployment for this season of your life. I'm your king. You're going to obey my commands. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to go over there, and I want you to start digging a ditch. And you dig the ditch just until I tell you otherwise. That's what I need you to do. I need it to start right there, and I need it to go that direction as long as you can take it. You just do that, okay? Now, if you understand who you are as a rebel that has been forgiven by the king, as a rebel who's been saved by the king, when the king looks down at you and says, my child, I have saved you, and here's what I want you to do in my service. I want you to go dig the ditch. You don't fold your arms and look up at the throne and kick the dirt and say, dang! That's not what I wanted. I wanted to be a tank commander. I don't want to build a ditch. You don't do that. You go skipping off to build the best ditch that's ever been built in the history of humanity. And you do it until the king calls you back and gives you another deployment. I mean, for some of you, that's your story, right? The king has called you to do something you don't particularly want to do. You think you're made for bigger stuff. My friend, just be patient. You don't know what the king is doing in this cosmic plan that he's working out through the world. But what you do know is that you've been saved from him. You should have been crushed by his army, and now you've been invited into his army, and he's asked you to go do something for this particular season of your life. Go do it, and do it well. For some of you, it's exactly the opposite story. I mean, you stood before the king, and he said, my child, I've saved you, I forgive you, now I'm calling you into my service, and what I need you to do is go command that tank battalion over there. And you're thinking, oh, gosh, I would just rather dig a ditch. Same thing for you. Same thing for you. You don't know necessarily why the king has deployed you there or over there or for this much time, or maybe it's for your life, or maybe it's for the next week or the next 24 hours. You don't know. But whatever he's called you to do it well. I mean, brother or sister, maybe what the king has told you to do for this particular season of your life is, I need you to wait. I don't have any particular employment for you right now, but just wait. Sit down here at my feet. Get to know me a little bit better. And when the time's right, I'll send you where you belong. The king never, ever wastes a minute. Don't think that he does. He's sovereign over every detail of your life, including your job. Here's third. Third thing, number 3. Even, or maybe even especially in your job, cultivate a quiet, patient trust in God. Even in your job, cultivate a quiet, patient trust in God. I think you can probably see that in Joseph throughout his whole story. I mean, from the time that Joseph has those dreams in chapter 37, I mean, through everything his brothers and Potiphar and his fellow prisoners put him through, he just seems from beginning to end to have this remarkable confidence in the fact that God is sovereign over everything that's happening. Now, I think as we read that story, or as somebody tells it to us and we think about it, it's a little bit hard for us to see Joseph's quiet confidence in God because it's obvious to us what's going to happen. We've read the story before, and we know that, okay, yes, Joseph, you're in the house of Potiphar, and things aren't going well for you, or you're cleaning the latrines in the prison. But guess what? In just a few years, you're going to end up being Grand Vizier of Egypt, so it's all okay. And so we don't feel the tension of what it must have been like for Joseph as he was in Potiphar's house or down in the prison or whatever else. We know the end of the story. Joseph didn't know the end of the story. And yet he maintained his trust in God. I mean, think about what he must have been thinking in that pit. His brothers threw him down in a pit and waited for a caravan to go by to whom they could sell him. And they were sitting around eating food and plotting whether to kill him or not. 10 of his brothers wanted to kill him. One brother didn't want to kill him. And he's wondering which of those two factions is going to win down in that pit. I mean, think about the negotiation when he's being sold into slavery. They're up there talking to the caravan, trying to figure out whether they're going to sell him for $50 or $20. And he's down in the pit just wondering if he's ever going to see his mom and dad again. And he's 17 years old. He didn't know how this is going to end. He gets sold to Potiphar. He does what's right over and over again. He does what's right, and he gets thrown in prison for doing what's right. He asks the cupbearer to remember him into the face of the king. When he gets back to his position, the cupbearer completely forgets about him, and he just languishes there in prison for 2 whole years. I mean, what's he thinking during that time? We don't know. The Bible never tells us. It doesn't tell us what he's thinking, but we do know that he never loses his faith in God. He never loses his trust in God. Even in the midst of all of that, he serves Potiphar well, serves the prison well. He doesn't lose his integrity with Potiphar's wife. He even takes care when people come to him with all these dreams. He tells the cupbearer, and then he tells the baker, and then he tells Pharaoh himself, look, this interpreting dream things, I know it's really cool, but it's not just a gift that I've got. It comes from the God of heaven, a God that you don't know. Friends, I think that quiet trust that Joseph has in God throughout every single one of his deployments from the Lord is an amazing model for us. It's an amazing model because you and I, like Joseph, have to decide here and now that we're going to trust and obey God regardless of the circumstances in our lives. Even when you look around you and you don't see any blessing of God whatsoever, when you can't see the end of the story, when you think that God has forgotten you, when you don't like any of the circumstances that he's put into your life, when you're at your end of your rope waiting on him, you've got to decide here and now, even when I get to the very rock bottom, I'm going to obey him and trust him anyway. I mean, how easy would it have been for Joseph to just say, oh my gosh, forget it. I mean, 1.5 years into that prison time, how easy would it have been for him to say, forget it, I know I had the dreams, but forget the dreams. None of that's happening. They were all supposed to bow down to me, and now here I am in a prison. Maybe I'll just become an Egyptian and start worshiping Ra for as much good as Yahweh is doing for me. I mean, how easy would it have been for Joseph to just blame God for putting him in that position? Look, God, I'm tired of it. I've had it. I've been listening to you. I've been obeying you and obeying you and obeying you and trusting you and doing everything right that you told me to do. I've been maintaining my integrity when a powerful woman of Egypt comes on to me. I've done everything that you said, and look where it's landed me. I'm in prison. My brothers and sisters, maybe that's you. Maybe that's you and the job that you've got or the circumstance. Your relationships with your family or your friends or your boss, maybe even your church. Oh God, I've been waiting on you. I've been trying to be patient. I've been keeping on a good face. I've even been saying nice things about you to everybody who asks. But look where it's gotten me. I'm done. I'm taking a break. Oh, brothers and sisters, hang on. Like Joseph, hang on. Keep struggling, keep waiting, keep obeying, keep trusting. God's providence is an extremely long road. Sometimes, brothers and sisters, God's providence is a longer road even than our earthly lives. And for some Christians, things don't finally equal out and make sense until the day they stand before Jesus and see his face. And only then does it all click together. Some faithful servants of God spend their entire lives waiting for things that never come. I mean, think how long it was between the time that Joseph's family arrived in Egypt to the time that God rescued them from slavery in Egypt in the Exodus. It was 400 years. That's thousands and millions of Israelites. Dozens of generations in there of Israelites who were crying out for redemption from Egypt, who were crying out for God to rend the heavens and come down and rescue them, and who died waiting and crying out for redemption. It didn't come. Friend, you need to decide now that even in a circumstance like that, even when God decides not to give you what you long for in this life, you trust him and you obey him anyway. It's like Peter said, Lord, where are we going to go? You have the words of life. Here's number 4. Number 4, what matters is not finally your particular job, but faithful, energetic service to the King. What matters is not your particular job, but rather faithful, energetic service to the King. That's what Joseph did. And he did it whether he liked the job or not. I mean, think about it. Do you think, the Bible says over and over again, we've already talked about this, we've already talked about the fact that Joseph did every job that he did with excellence. It says it over and over again. In Potiphar's house, he did what he did with excellence. In the prison, he did what he did with excellence. As Grand Vizier of Egypt, he did what he did with excellence. Do you think Joseph did all of those jobs with excellence because he particularly liked the jobs? I don't. I don't think he liked being a slave in Potiphar's house. I don't think he liked being cleaning latrines in the prison. I don't think he enjoyed that. I don't even think he enjoyed being the head of the prison. I don't even think Joseph enjoyed particularly being the Grand Vizier of Egypt. Now, why not? Why do I think that? Well, it's because the very first time that he saw his brothers who had come to buy food from Canaan, what does he do? He weeps. He weeps. He can't even stay in their presence. He has to go to a back room and weep because he wants to be home with his mom. He wants to go home and see his dad. He doesn't want to be the Grand Vizier of Egypt. I don't think Joseph particularly liked any job that he had throughout the entire course of his life. And yet he did them excellently. Why? It wasn't so much because he loved the jobs. It was because he loved his God. And he knew his God had put him there. Friend, if you have a particular job, if you have a particular deployment right now in your life, it is because God is the one who has deployed you there. So don't mail it in. Don't mail it in with your job. Don't mail it in with your church. Don't mail it in with your clients or your boss. Don't do things half-baked. Don't say about your job, well, this doesn't really matter because I am called to something bigger and better. Don't say that. I mean, the fact is, Christians do that all the time, right? We rationalize half-baked work in the job that God has given us right now because we have this idea in our minds that we are called to something bigger and better. All right, I'll just mail it in as, the latrine cleaner at the prison because I'm called to be Grand Vizier of Egypt. And when God makes me Grand Vizier of Egypt and matches my call with reality, that's when I'll really start to work. But, you realize, right, that you don't have a calling from God to be Grand Vizier of Egypt? That's just a metaphor, right, anyway, whatever it is in your own head. You don't have a call to be Grand Vizier of Egypt until God makes you Grand Vizier of Egypt. Until then, you just have a desire to be the Grand Vizier of Egypt. That's it. My church has a ton of students from Southern Seminary in Louisville because we're in town and lots of students at Southern Seminary. And I don't know how many conversations I have with 18, 19, 20-year-old guys who will strut up to me and put their chest out and say, I am called to be a pastor. I'm like, oh, really? What church do you pastor now? Look, I think. Let me give you a couple of ways to discern God's calling in your life. If we're even going to use the word calling, if you're going to use the word calling, I'd rather use something like deployment or assignment or something like that doesn't sound so permanent and so necessary for your life to have meaning and all the rest. If you're going to use the word calling, though, let me give you 2 ways to discern it. Here's the first way. Just look down at your feet. No, I'm serious. Wherever you are standing right now with the responsibilities and opportunities God has given you, that's your calling from the Lord right now. Now, that may change tomorrow. It may change 10 years from now. It may never change. Usually it does. But look down at your feet. That's what the Lord has called you to, and you need to engage that with everything you've got. Let me give you just another little rubric for thinking about calling. A calling, if we're going to use that language again, is made up of 3 things. It's made up of desire and gifting and opportunity. Desire and gifting and opportunity. A lot of times we just take the first of those, desire, and we say that our desire is a calling. It's not. It may very well be that you have a desire to do something that you're simply not gifted for. That's why you need to be a part of a local church and friends with people who can tell you, no, brother, sister, I don't think you're really gifted to do that thing you really want to do. Or yes, I do think you're gifted to do that thing you want to do. A desire does not equal a calling. You can even take desire and gifting and stick it together. This is what the guys in my church do all the time. They take their desire and they take the fact that somebody told them in their church they were going to be the next Billy Graham, and they say they have a calling to be a pastor. But there's no opportunity that God has given yet. He hasn't. No church has called them to be pastor. Nobody's voted on them. Nobody's asked them to be an elder in a church. They have a desire, and they might have a gifting for it. They don't have an opportunity. But when desire for something and the gifting to do it and the opportunity in God's providence come together, that's when you might have a call to do something different. Don't mistake your desire for a calling. All right, here's number 5, the last thing. Number 5, whatever your job, whatever the mechanics of the job, no matter whether you like it or not, leave the results to God. Do your job with excellence, as to the Lord, not to men, but leave the results to God. I think so much discontent, so much idolatry, and so much idleness in our jobs is caused because we are trying to wrangle those jobs toward a certain goal. We want those jobs to matter in an eternal sense. We want our jobs to change the world. We want our jobs to be significant, or a lot of times it's more to make us significant in the world. We want to make lots of money. Whatever it is, we try our best to wrangle our jobs and our lives and everything about us into a certain goal. We want them to matter in a certain significant way. But here's what I want you to see about the life of Joseph. The last thing I want you to see about the life of Joseph, when you think about how his story played out, it's actually shocking how it comes to an end. Because even though he wound up ruling the greatest superpower on the face of the planet in that day, it is amazing how irrelevant Joseph actually turned out to be in the only story that matters. He turned out to be utterly irrelevant. Let me try to explain quickly how this is. Genesis from beginning to end, is really the story of God's promises to Abraham. Starting in chapter 12, that's what's going on. God gives this set of promises to Abraham, and then you've got the story of several generations that begin to pass. And the question is always, okay, Abraham's got the promises now. Who gets them next? Is it Isaac or is it Ishmael? Who's going to get those promises when Abraham dies? Well, the whole thing goes through, and you think it's going to be Ishmael. It turns out to be Isaac. Boom, the promises drop to Isaac. Then you've got Isaac handing them off to Esau, his older. Oh, nope, it's not Esau, it's Jacob. And then it just moves down through this whole thing. And the story of the whole book of Genesis is that you're supposed to have drumming through your mind that the promises of God go from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob to Joseph. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. You do it. I'm serious. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. That's what you're supposed to get. But if you got a Bible, just turn over to Matthew 1, the genealogy of Jesus, because that's where this whole thing is headed to anyway. So Matthew writes at the very beginning of his book, the historical record of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And then verse 2, it's incredible. Abraham fathered Isaac. Isaac fathered Jacob. Jacob fathered Joseph. Judah. Joseph is gone. He's just gone. Not mentioned again. He just turns out to be surprisingly irrelevant. I mean, you know what's going on there, right? It's just God reminding us that he has the capacity to surprise us in all kinds of ways and that he's sovereign over the whole thing. I mean, you get down into the details of Genesis, even more than that, because it turns out that Jacob ends up having 12 sons, right? And then the whole story of the book of Genesis from like chapter 30 or something all the way up to it just this ginormous game of Kill the Carrier. Any of you ever play Kill the Carrier out on the playground? You may have had different names for it, but it's this game where you throw the football up and one kid catches it and then he runs, right? And everybody just like smears him and then he has to get up and he throws the ball up again and somebody else catches it and blah, blah, blah. That's what's happening with the promises of God throughout the whole book of Genesis. It literally is. So Jacob's got them, right? Jacob's got the promises of God. And you think, okay, who's it going to be now? Is it Abraham, Isaac, Jacob? It's going to be Reuben, the oldest, right? So the ball passes to Reuben. Reuben's got the promises. And then, no, in chapter 35, he sins against his father, and it can't be Reuben, so he throws the ball up. Well, maybe it's going to be somebody else. Maybe it's going to be the second son or the third son or the fourth son, and you just go through all these different people, and each one of them has to throw it up because they sin in various ways. And then you think, okay, all right, maybe it's going to be the little dude, Joseph. Yeah, there he goes. Look at him. Coat of many colors. No, sold into slavery. That's not good. Oh, the Potiphar's wife thing is going to mess him. Oh, he survived that. Look at that. Oh, yep, look at the Grand Vizier of Egypt. There it is. Grand Vizier of Egypt. He's the guy that ends up with the ball. And then you get to the very end of Genesis when Jacob is finally blessing his sons. And he passes over the Grand Vizier of Egypt and places his hand on Judah and says, from his feet the scepter shall not pass until it lands in the hand that it belongs in. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah. Friend, God is sovereign over every detail of your life, and you don't know how he's going to work it all out, but it doesn't finally matter because he's sovereign and you're doing it for him, and it all winds up at the feet of Jesus anyway. Maybe in that day he'll pull it all together for us and say, look, here's how that ditch actually cut Satan's advance off over here. Or here's how your tank battalion caused this to happen in the war. Or here's how you just sitting on the bench for a few months changed you so that you could go over there and do the next thing. Maybe he's going to reveal all that to us. Maybe not. But it doesn't matter because at the end, we're going to say, to you, O Lamb of God, belong all praise and glory and wisdom and honor forever and ever and ever.